Hello, everybody, and welcome wherever you are joining us from today. My name is Philip Steenkamp. I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University. Thank you so much for being with us for another virtual edition of our 25th anniversary Changemakers Speakers Series. Our guest today, my great pleasure to tell you, is journalist and historian Gwyn Dyer, who is joining us from London, England. Royal Roads bestowed him with an honorary doctorate in 2002. Now, I would like to start by acknowledging that our campus, where I am coming to you from today, is located on the traditional lands of the Kosapsan and Lekwungen ancestors and families. And it is with great gratitude that we live, work, and learn on these lands. Haishke Siem. So thank you for joining us for this event, and I do encourage you to participate. Please feel free to connect with each other in the comments section and to type your questions that you may have in the chat. I will ask some of those questions for you a little later. So let's get started. We recently celebrated the 25th anniversary of Royal Roads as a public university with the launch of our new vision. Our new vision statement is inspiring people with the courage to transform the world. And this speakers series is a celebration of that anniversary and that vision. The original plan, of course, for this series was to host the speakers series at in-person venues around Victoria. Of course, the pandemic had other plans. But true to form, for Royal Roads, we found other ways to bring these events to life. Royal Roads is committed to taking on the biggest challenges of our time, whether that be climate change, racial justice, inequality, and what the world looks like after enduring a global pandemic. If you've missed the other talks in the series, they are available on rruchangemakers.ca. I've hosted the director of the Cascade Institute here at Royal Roads, Thomas Homer-Dixon, who took us through the challenging global landscape we are facing and left us with the message that hope is possible even on the brink of despair. I was also privileged to welcome the author Essie Edugyan to this virtual space, where she told us why she was passionate about examining the difficult themes of abuse and racism in her Giller Prize-winning book, Washington Black. It was my honor to welcome BC's Public Health Officer and Royal Roads honorary degree recipient, Dr. Bonnie Henry, to share what she has learned about pandemic perseverance and where it comes from. While these issues are incredibly complex, I feel more confident than ever that we are equipped to handle them. I believe that we can all work and learn and strive to improve our community and our world with a commitment to taking on these challenges together. Now, a great journalist asks the kinds of questions that get us to look a little deeper into these issues. And I think the intersection of history and journalism is the perfect combination for the chronically curious. Gwyn Dyer certainly qualifies as that. His columns and his work are published regularly around the world, but like me, his first love is history. His unflinching and in-depth exploration of modern issues from multiple interviews and volumes of research not only present a comprehensive review of the issues, but also advance the dialogue. His book, Climate Wars, based on his CBC Ideas series of the same name, examined the geopolitical implications of large-scale climate change. And over the past year, he has spent a lot of his pandemic time interviewing climate change experts for his next book, which is currently in progress. So tonight he's going to share with us some of what he's learned and what reasons we can find to hope for the future of our planet and ourselves. Gwyn joins us from his office in London, England tonight, where it's just after midnight, but we are assured that these are hours he doesn't mind keeping. So please join me in welcoming Gwyn Dyer. Over to you, Gwyn.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, it's midnight. What can I say? I want to start, we're talking about climate change, and I want to start with what I now think of as Adam Frank's law. Adam Frank is an astronomer by training, but for the last 5 or 6 years, he's also been calling himself an exobiologist. Exo as in non-Earth biologist, but we don't know of any life beyond Earth, so what is that about? It's a way of setting a perspective, and I think a very useful perspective. It certainly gives me a certain amount of solace. What Adam Frank says, or argues, is that any planet that produces a high-energy civilization like ours will also experience a climate emergency like ours. And the reason that will happen is that we all emergent civilized species, that is to say, with the intelligence to build a civilization, emerge from the status of wild animals, right? I mean, as our own ancestors were, hunter-gatherers living in small groups, chasing animals around the landscape, with all the appropriate habits, values, social structures to do that well. And they did that for several million years, more and more closely resembling us as time went on. So when we begin building a civilization, we don't actually understand where it's going to go and how we should go about building it. And therefore, we do it rather badly. Adam Frank is interested in talking about civilizations we don't know anything about in other parts of the universe, because it occurred to him, as to many other people around 15 years ago, when we started discovering that virtually every star had lots of planets, and that there are gazillions of galaxies, each with gazillions of stars, all of which have half a dozen planets or so, that it is diminishingly unlikely that none of them have ever had life or ever had intelligent life. God knows how many, and I don't insist that there are any, but it seems statistically rather improbable, given the scale of the universe, the 10 billion years it's had to evolve life on a gazillion planets, and the sheer improbability that none of them have ever done what 1 out of 8 planets in this solar system has done, that none of them ever evolved a civilization. And from that, he went on to say, well, what would happen if it did involve a civilization? Of course, the answer is, what happened to us? We emerge from hunter-gathererdom to begin farming, and suddenly discovered that we have an unlimited food supply because we can create it, and therefore we start having a population explosion. There, we do not, in fact, keep our population small. We breed up to the limit, but there is no limit because we can go on putting more land into farming. And so we have a population explosion. We have expanded from 10 million people, say, 10,000 years ago, to 8 billion today. That's an 800-fold expansion of population. So that we've pushed all the other living things on the planet, or at least animals on the surface of the planet, but also the forests. Human beings now account for approximately a quarter of the weight of large animal life on the planet, on the land surface of the planet. And if you count our domestic animals, around half, in fact, more than half of the actual weight of living things, large animals, on the land surface of the planet. So we kind of modified that. And of course, as we move into the more developed civilization, we start using energy in larger and larger amounts. And that also, and I won't go into this, affects the way the planet is operating. So we're pushing harder and harder on the planet. And of course, it begins to notice, which is what's happening now with the fires and the floods and all the rest of it. The first intimations that this is going to get really unpleasant after a while. And the point that Frank was making is you mustn't actually blame yourself too much, and certainly not beat yourself up about this, because it's bound to happen. If you start out as a species who are living in the wild and build a civilization, you're going to breed for quite a while before you learn birth control, and you're going to breed for a lot, for most of that time without any knowledge of what your numbers are. You're going to build a civilization using a lot of energy before you begin to understand that will have consequences beyond the ones you intend. So, yeah, we have made a mess, but in fact, we were almost bound to make a mess. Thank you, Adam Frank. It's a useful perspective, because I don't really think it's useful to beat ourselves up. What we have to do is think our way through this and not end up as probably some of the civilizations he imagines, by not making it through the climate crisis, by falling at the last but one hurdle and either, reverting to wild status or simply going extinct, whatever. So useful perspective. Now, on to the question of where are we now, where are we going, what do we do about it? And this is, of course, going to be a very swift passage through these questions. But I think, first of all, what I'm going to do is talk about where we are now and where our destination appears to be over the next, let's say, 30 to 50 years. And then about what we might do about it. And I'm not going to urge anybody to pull their socks up or, sort of take this seriously. I assume you already do take it seriously. So no chest beating, no guilt tripping. But here we are. A few ugly facts. First one, we are committing ourselves now to blowing through the aspirational limit of global warming to 1.5 degrees higher than the pre-industrial average global temperature. That was the target that was set in 2016 at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Summit of that year, 2015. Aspirational because they thought even then they probably weren't going to be able to make it, but we really should try not to let the warming go beyond 1.5 degrees average global temperature. Well, I'm afraid aspirational was the right word because we are blowing through that now. We are not at 1.5 degrees. Actually, the average global temperature is about 1.1 degrees higher than the pre-industrial average right now. But there is a time lag when you put carbon dioxide in particular into the atmosphere, and that's the main warming gas. The rule of thumb is that if you put a given volume of gas into the air, or carbon dioxide into the air, it will give you half of the warming it will ultimately produce in the first 10 years and another quarter in the following 100 years. And then the final quarter will come straggling in over the next 1,000 years. So when you dump that in the atmosphere, you don't get the consequences right away. We are currently dumping enough in the atmosphere to guarantee that in due course, we will go through 1.5. I mean, we are at 420, give or take a few, parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now. And that's pretty close to guaranteeing us that we will eventually, in 10 or 15 years, be feeling that on our skins 1.5. So if you didn't like the past year, stand by, it's going to get worse. It was never a realistic goal. It was an incentive, and I think its time has passed. The emissions would have had to start declining right away. They're not declining at all. And frankly, you'd also have had to start removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere right away back in 2015. We're still not doing that. In fact, the technologies to do it are not yet out of the labs. So, ugly fact number 2, the real never exceed limit, which is don't ever let it get hotter than 2 degrees Celsius higher average global temperature than the pre-industrial average. That is still not surpassed, but we are definitely looking like we're going to exceed that as well. The only way I can believe that we won't go through 2 degrees as well, 450 parts per million is what gives you 2 degrees after the usual lag. The only way we can avoid doing that is if we cut global emissions by half by 2030, which is a fairly large order because so far we haven't ever cut them at all. In the one exception being 2020 with the lockdown, but we're back up already and moving on. in the past 30 years since we got the bad news that we have a climate change problem and we better start cutting our emissions, we have in fact doubled them. We have never shrunk them. So, believing that we can, cut them by half in 2030, if you can believe that, squeeze your eyes tight shut. And if we have carbon dioxide removal technologies, which they mentioned back in 2015, if we have those carbon dioxide removal technologies out of the labs and available and working by 2030, and if China changes its promise from getting to net zero emissions in 2060 and goes with everybody else net zero emissions in 2050, and then everybody keeps their promises about how they're going to get to net zero by 2050. If you can believe all that, then we may not hit and surpass 2 degrees higher average global temperature in the 2040s. If I were a betting man, I would want better than even odds on that. I am a betting man. Get in touch with me afterwards. These calculations, bad news number 3, depend on the warming remaining linear. And it's pretty linear right now. You put some more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, wait a bit, and lo and behold, a predictable amount of warming will occur and the accompanying weather and so on. But we know that in warming times, climate change sometimes goes non-linear. That is to say, it makes a big lurch forward rather than simply rising gradually and smoothly and predictably. The non-linear changes are quite frightening because we don't know when they will hit, and we don't know how big they will be, and we will not have much time to respond to them. I'll give you one example. I haven't got a lot of time here, but for example, there's a lot of warming going on in the Arctic now. For various reasons I haven't got time to go into. The warming is more intense in the Arctic. It's not hotter in the Arctic everywhere else, but in terms of compared to what it used to be, the warming is twice as fast in the Arctic as in most other parts of the planet. There's a lot of carbon dioxide and methane, more to the point, because it's an even more powerful warming gas, locked up in the permafrost, the frozen ground around the Arctic Ocean, and indeed under the Arctic Ocean as well, in the seabed. And as long as it stays frozen, then it's not a problem in the atmosphere. But as the Arctic warms, at a certain point, some of that's going to start to melt and release release methane in particular into the atmosphere in large quantities. And that becomes a feedback because that speeds the warming process, melts more methane, more permafrost, more methane goes into the atmosphere, higher warming, so on, feedback. There are a number of feedbacks up there somewhere, and we are going to trip over them at various points. And those are nonlinear events. And as you get higher up into the warming process, you get closer to them. The reason we actually have 2 degrees average global temperatures, the never exceed point, is because scientists, to the extent that they have figured it out, fear that that's when you really start triggering the nonlinear events. We haven't yet figured out either, and I've talked to the people who are studying this, and they're working very hard at it and learning a lot quite rapidly, but we haven't got the answers all down yet. It is also possible that the nonlinear events can cascade. One triggers another, and you get into not complete runaway. I mean, the planet doesn't turn into Venus or something, but it gets a lot hotter in a hurry. And if that were to happen, and it cannot be excluded, then we would find that we were heading well north of 2 degrees, to 3 degrees higher average global temperature, 4, 5, 6 by the end of the century. It is not inconceivable that we could be there. That's pretty ugly. You know, you're having 1.1 now, and we've got more powerful hurricanes. We've got wildfires consuming half the state of California. We've got floods in Germany and China washing away, you know, flooding the subway and all the rest of it. If you didn't like that, you really won't like 5 degrees higher. But it is conceivable that that could happen. Now, if it does happen, and I'm not being a scaremonger here, if it does happen, if you find that you're on a planet, or your grandchildren are on a planet 5 or 6 degrees higher at the end of the century, they will have a great deal of trouble, because the human race at the moment lives almost everywhere on the land surface of the planet. But a lot of the climate niches it lives in now will become uninhabitable when the temperature goes up like that. There are some bits in the Persian Gulf, for example, which will probably become uninhabitable in areas that haven't got air conditioning within the next 25 years. But larger and larger parts of the planet will, in fact, become uninhabitable. You cannot afford to go out in the daytime and do work outdoors. And probably you can't grow much in the way of useful crops either. As we get up into the higher levels, if we do get up into the higher levels, 4, 5, 6 degrees, even 3 higher, which is possible if you get into the Cascades. So we have a problem. I'm not saying, by the way, that the human race is going to go extinct. I don't think it's going to go extinct, but you could lose 90% of the population if you really ended up at 6 degrees. And you would lose it in ways that might destroy civilization, because, of course, then not everybody is going to die quietly. There will be waves of refugees. There will be, you know, all sorts of borders slamming shut to keep the refugees out. All that stuff will occur if we end up in the higher levels of warming. But, you know, we're not going to go extinct. As Jim Lovelock said to me one day, the Gaia fellow, he said, you know, human beings are a tough species. There will always be a few breeding pairs, he said. I like Jim. But there we are. That's as bad as it could get, and it's really seriously bad. 2 more bits of bad news, and then we'll get on with what on earth we do about it rather quickly. First of all, averages lie. Average global temperature. I've been using average global temperature all the way through this, and it's a very useful number because it's a single number that describes where the whole planetary system is going, but it's not very valuable in terms of telling you what it's going to be like in, let's say, randomly, Victoria. On the contrary, the average global temperature is quite misleading if you happen to live on the land surface of the planet, because 2/3 of the planet is in fact ocean. And of course, we're taking into account the temperatures over the ocean as well, which are almost always cooler than over the land. I've been in several navies, and I've noticed that every time. So when you say, for example, that we're heading for 2 degrees higher average global temperature, what that actually means is that it will be, on average, about 1 degree higher over the ocean and around 3 degrees higher over the land surface of the planet. That's at 2 degrees average global temperature for the planet as a whole. And in fact, if you go long way inland, it probably will be 4 degrees higher. So, you know, if you happen to be on an island in the Northeast Pacific, and like Vancouver Island, when it says 2 degrees higher, yeah, you probably might even be a little bit below 2 degrees higher because you're surrounded by ocean, but it will be 4 degrees higher in Ontario, and so on. The averages lie. The average regional temperature can get a lot worse. Final ugly fact. Suppose we did actually, miracles happen, stop at, let's say, 2 degrees, 2 and a bit degrees, net zero, no more emissions, or at least as much coming out as goes into the air in terms of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in 2050. Okay, problem solved? No, not unless you really like 2 degrees hotter and all the implications for weather, crops, and all the rest of it. And it will be a lot more unpleasant than now, I promise you that, because you've just stopped the warming. You haven't solved the problem. You haven't taken that carbon dioxide back out of the air. That has to be done too, which is why, mercifully, they are now beginning to work on carbon dioxide removal technologies. We can talk about some of them when we get to questions, if you like. But the task is enormous because we've been dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for 200 odd years, and over the last 50 years, a great deal of it. Currently, we are dumping, get this right, 43 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere this year. Last year, as I said, was a bit lower, but it was 43 billion in 2019. So how do you get that out of the atmosphere again? And the answer is not easily. I mean, there are ways to do it. You can extract it directly, or you can grow forests and suck up some of it that way, or it can go into the ocean, although that causes problems for the ocean. It acidifies it, for sea life suffers. But if you want to go back to a comfortable, familiar, traditional climate, you've got to figure out ways to take this out. And that is going to take a long time. I'll just give you a quick example. Right in British Columbia, in Squamish, there's an outfit called Carbon Engineering that is now well into the testing process on what's called direct air capture, DAC, which is drawing air in, taking the carbon dioxide oxide out of it, and storing it or whatever, turning it into some carbon neutral fuel or sticking it down into the ground, taking it out of circulation. They're building or beginning to build their first industrial scale plants right now, one in Texas, one in Scotland. They will be able to draw out 1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. Those plants are going to cost $500 million each, and they'll be drawing out 1 million tons a year each. And you would need 43,000 plants like that to draw down the amount of carbon dioxide we are dumping into the atmosphere this year. 43 billion. How many plants do you need? So the task will be not decades long, certainly generations long, maybe centuries long. We're in this for the long haul, I'm afraid. But it could be done. It may be done. I'm not saying we're doomed. I'm saying we have a task ahead of us, which is enormous, and all sorts of surprises, not all of them ugly, but most of them unpleasant, waiting us in the process that we will have to deal with. One of them, by the way, being when you start drawing the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, well, the oceans have kindly absorbed about 600 billion tons of carbon dioxide. But the only reason they've absorbed it is because there's so much in the air that partial pressure is driving some of it into the oceans. If you start taking carbon dioxide out of the air, some of the carbon dioxide in the oceans will come out to replace it because it's not being driven into the oceans anymore. So long task, long, difficult task. Basically, it probably will take as much industrial effort to pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as it did to put it there. The whole industrial revolution in reverse. Why would we be surprised by that? So we have signed up for a rather large task, inadvertently, but it's ours. Global mass mobilization on the scale of the world wars would certainly allow us to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But as I said, I'm not really to bet on that without being offered odds, because we haven't cut emissions at all yet. 30 years into the process. So it would be prudent to assume we will not be working miracles right away, but we could do it. The alternative sources of carbon neutral energy are now available at scale, but fossil fuels still provide the same 80% of global energy that they did at the beginning of our knowledge of the process back in the 1980s. It's still 80%. Oh, we put in enormous amounts of solar power and wind power and all the rest of it, but demand's been going up the whole time. So we're putting in that, but also putting in coal-fired power and all the rest of it. And the proportion stays the same, alas. We've got to turn that around. Other sources of CO2, like agriculture, especially producing protein in the form of meat, account for most of the rest of the emissions, the other 20%. And dealing with those, as you can imagine, is also going to be very difficult. There are 2 billion people who live by farming. Not one of them would escape being affected by what we have to do to get that done. So, a task that is very large. It could end up very badly. When Adam Frank runs his little, he does models of the societies, and you sort of, when did they figure out they had a problem? When did they start doing something about it? What happened to them in the end? And he runs these thousands of times with various inputs. Some of them don't make it. They just plummet like a rock. They disappear from the graph. Others manage to survive. Almost all of them suffer a major dieback. So but then they recover. So there are no guarantees, but we could do this. I'm not saying we can't. But here's where we get to the heavily controversial part. I always kind of dread coming to it, but I have to say it. What are we going to do if we miss all the exits on this highway and we are heading for 3 degrees higher average global temperature, so say 6 degrees in Ontario, and we haven't got the carbon dioxide emissions completely down yet, and we're certainly not even beginning to take a chunk out of the problem of getting carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. What do we do? Because we don't get anything done if people start fleeing because they're starving where they are now, and the border slams shut, and the war shooting starts at the borders and all the rest of it. Nobody's cooperating. Nothing's getting done. The problem doesn't get solved and just goes on getting worse. We are going to have to deal with the heat. And there are ways of doing this. And they're called geoengineering. Well, drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is also geoengineering. Frankly, putting it into the atmosphere is geoengineering. But the kind that people get very upset about and start cursing is geoengineering that would hold the heat down while we work on the rest of the problem. Because if we let the heat get too bad, we won't be able to work on the rest of the problem. And that comes in 2 forms, basically. One is called stratospheric aerosol injections, SAI, and the other is called marine cloud brightening, MCB. In both cases, what you're doing is you're putting aerosols, tiny particles, which are reflective of incoming sunlight, into either the area just above the ocean surface, and you spray up tiny particles of salt, and they form droplets that thicken up the low-lying cloud and reflect sunlight. Or alternatively, you spray sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere about 20 kilometers high, where it forms tiny droplets that will, again, reflect incoming sunlight. There's no living things up there. Sulfur's not a pleasant thing, but we live amid, we sort of fill the lower atmosphere anyway with it, with our industry. So a little bit in the stratosphere is not a huge difference. I haven't got time to go into it. A lot of people think this is actually evil. I think it is probably going to be necessary because we are not going to get the whole task done simply by cutting emissions in the time available. So if you accept that that is likely, then you have to start thinking about these things as well. When do you have to start thinking about them? I would think that when you know you're condemned to go to 2 degrees, when you know that, it's no longer imaginable that we are going to manage to cut emissions fast enough to avoid going through 2 degrees, which I'd say you will know by 2035, 15, 14 years from now, that, by then you're going to have to make a decision on this, and probably you need to have been playing around with the technology for a while before that, if your decision means anything. So there we are. And that's why I call this talk Planetary Maintenance Engineers. Jim Lovelock, I mentioned him already, the Gaia guy. I read this, he wrote a book a long time ago, first book he wrote, 1979. And this is what he said. He said, as the transfer of power to our species proceeds, our responsibility for maintaining planetary homeostasis, stability, increases whether we're conscious of the fact or not. Each time we significantly alter some part of the natural process of regulation, we are increasing the probability that one of these changes will weaken the stability of the entire system. We shall have to tread carefully to avoid the cybernetic disasters of runaway positive feedback or of sustained oscillation. This could happen if man had encroached upon Gaia's functional powers to such an extent that it disabled it, the Earth system, as we call it now, Gaia. He would then wake up one day to find that he had the permanent lifetime job of planetary maintenance engineer. Gaia would have retreated into the muds, and the ceaseless, intricate task of keeping all the global cycles in balance would be ours. Then at last, we should be riding that strange contraption, the spaceship Earth, and whatever tamed and domesticated biosphere remained would indeed be our life support system. I saw Jim a couple of months ago. I went down to Dorset, and he's 102 now, but still in good shape. And I quoted that to him. I said, are we there yet? He said, no, which I knew he would say. But we're closing in on us, so we better get our socks pulled up. I promise not to say that, but I'm saying it. Stay well, keep calm, and carry on. Thank you.
Gwyn, I'm almost speechless, actually, sort of trying to process everything you've said. Thank you so much for an incredibly engaging talk, thought-provoking, to use that cliche, but it really is thought-provoking and hopefully action-provoking as well. Here in the Pacific Northwest this summer, we had what has been called the heat dome, where we had temperatures hit 49.5 degrees in Lytton, British Columbia. And I think that gave us a little taste of some of those abrupt, non-linear changes. It was quite a terrifying experience for us. I mean, I was born and grew up in Africa, in the desert in Africa, in Botswana. I've never experienced heat like I did here in British Columbia this summer. Where this leads me in terms of a question for you is, how can people still be denying climate change is being caused by human activity? I mean, we even see in the federal election right now, there are political parties and politicians who are still denying human agency in this area. So the question really for you is, this is a big cognitive challenge as well. And in the work you've done and the people you've spoken to, could you give us any sense of how you think we're really going to change minds? I mean, Mark Carney talks about the tragedy of the horizon, that people don't have to live with the consequences of what they're currently doing, so they don't take the necessary actions. But the consequences seem upon us right now. But back to that question, how do we change minds?
Love me, first of all. But I'm not as pessimistic about that. Because in fact, I think there has been a significant shift across the West. And although I haven't been able to travel elsewhere in the last year or two because of the pandemic, I suspect in other parts of the world, particularly China and India as well. It's the consequences coming home to roost that's driving it. I mean, I would say we've had some very helpful contributions like Greta doing her thing and so on. Those things work. They get people's attention, but mostly the attention of people who are already sort of aware of the problem, but having to stand on the seat in your subway car because otherwise you're going to drown definitely does get the donkey's attention, including the attention of a great many donkeys who are watching this. So I always kind of expected that we would start to see the thing taken seriously when it started to hurt. The business about the horizon you just mentioned. Now, will it last? Yes, it will, because the disasters are going to last and increase. Will it move fast enough? God knows. How fast is fast enough? I don't know. I mean, it depends. There are surprises. There are landmines down the road. But I think we are coming to the point where major investment is going to happen. Major social and industrial changes are already happening. Here I am in England, which is run by a conservative government, and frankly, one of the worst governments I've ever seen in England. It's going to be illegal to produce or sell cars that use petroleum-based fuels in England after 2030. That's only 9 years away. I mean, so something's happening. The same rule in France. In Norway, it's going to be 2025, 4 years from now. No, I mean, there will be some legacy, internal combustion engine cars on the road for another decade or so. I had to give my car away. It was 22 years old, so it probably needed to be given away. And I gave it away because it was almost a vintage car, because it was going to be illegal to go on driving it in London after next month because it emits too much. And there's nothing you can do about the engine of a car that was made in 1998 or whatever it was. So things are starting to happen. And the question is, will it speed up? Will it maintain momentum at least? People don't welcome bad news. The number of people I know who have had serious diseases and refused to see a doctor until it really started to hurt is too many.
Well, thank you, Gwyn, for that. One of the other things that struck me in your talk, you talked about cascades, and interestingly enough, we have an institute on our campus called the Cascade Institute, headed by Dr. Tad Homer-Dixon. And you are familiar with Tad's work. He's sort of written in this area. In fact, he's doing some research right now on permafrost. So I was very interested to hear you talk about permafrost and how that, in fact, hasn't really been calculated, hasn't been taken into account in some of the current calculations, and how that might be an example of a very significant, abrupt, sort of non-linear change. But, in talking to Tad and others, and I was reading Bill Gates's book the other day too, there's a lot of emphasis put on the technological solutions here as well. And some people call this techno-optimism. Wondered if you could just comment a little bit about that. I mean, you mentioned the serious carbon capture technologies are not yet out of the lab. But do you think in all these calculations we're relying too much on technological solutions?
No, I don't. I mean, we created this problem with technology, not bad behavior. So I suspect we mostly will have to solve it with technology, not bad behavior. and of course we should drive our cars less when you can afford it, and if they're affordable, get an electric car or something like that, or just take public transport if you live in a city that manages to have some. And we should eat less meat or stop eating it entirely, and we should all of that stuff. But frankly, all of that stuff together won't solve the problem. The bulk of the problem of those 80% of emissions is not people refusing to ride bikes, or even, flying the Atlantic once a year. Maybe people flying the Atlantic once a week are a big part of the problem, but of the aviation problem. But really, it is large industrial and agricultural organizations that do the damage, the bulk of the damage. Consciousness raising is valuable, and even beyond the relatively small influence that individual decisions can make, it's helpful because it focuses people's attention on the problem. But basically, if you are not doing the political work as a voter, and you're just doing lifestyle changes, you are part of the problem. Because we've got to solve the big stuff. And that is done collectively by the society, politically, not by individuals.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Gwen. I'd like to turn to some questions we now have from the audience. We got some questions in advance, and I know that the audience listening right now is sending questions in too. So we have a question from Christine on Facebook, and it sort of relates to the issue we were just talking about. Is nuclear power the only viable option to replace fossil fuels?
Nuclear power?
Yes.
No, it's not the only viable option, but it is a viable option. I mean, I think that there's been a massive confusion that's infected a lot of people who sort of put nuclear weapons and nuclear power in the same bag. And so you have the bizarre case, for example, after the Fukushima non-catastrophe. I mean, it was a meltdown. It didn't kill anybody, actually, which is frequent. I mean, a lot of people died in the tidal wave, the tsunami, but nobody died in the meltdown. But after that, both Japan and Germany, which had a lot of nuclear power, announced that they were going to shut it down. Well, how are they going to replace it? They were going to burn more coal. That's not sensible. So I have no problem with nuclear power. The only problem I've got is that it seems in most cases to be more expensive than putting in the equivalent megawattage of offshore wind farms or solar arrays or whatever. But if you can make it at the same rate, or if you need to put it somewhere where you don't have good wind or sun, then by all means do so. And frankly, the real ace in the hole, if it ever comes out of the hole, is fusion power, which is beginning to look a little bit promising, actually, after all these, promised for a year, all of them broken for 40 or 50 years. Now we are actually seeing some action on the fusion front. But fission's fine. I don't have a problem with that.
Thank you. We have a question from Richard, and I think you probably answered this question, but he's asking if we reduced emissions by 50%, and I'm assuming he's meaning generally, globally. Yeah, would it even make a difference?
Oh, that would make a difference. That would make a difference. I just don't actually believe it's going to happen. But I really want it to. And I don't wish to discourage anybody. But to go from adding more every year to cutting by half in the next 9 years is perhaps a large ask. But it would make a hell of a difference. Actually getting half of it, getting down by 25% would make a lot of difference. I mean, it would make a difference right away in the sense that you're not getting that half of the effect of the emissions that hits you in the next 10 years. So it makes a difference in your own lifetime. And it would make a hell of a difference in the longer run. Anything you do now is more valuable than what you do 10 years down the road, and infinitely more valuable than what you do 30 years down the road in terms of emissions. Because once you put them there, they're there for a very long time. If you can just postpone them, it helps.
Yeah. I was very struck by your comment in your talk just about the the time scale of these impacts. So understanding that any action we take today is obviously better than any action even tomorrow. We have a question from Kent, and that question is: will the loss of summer ice in the Arctic liberate methane from the permafrost? And do you have a sense of the scale of the problem?
We're losing the summer ice. There's no question about that. It's down by half at the end of the summer melt season in the past 30 years. Will that directly lead to permafrost melting? It's not clear that it would, because the permafrost is either on land and subject to different influences, though it's not completely detached, and generally buried a couple of feet underground, because the permafrost, there's an active layer that thaws every summer. It's underneath that, the permafrost, so it's a bit insulated, shall we say. And the stuff on the seabed, there was a particular case a couple of years ago off the North Siberian coast, northeastern Siberia, where a scientific expedition actually at sea discovered that they were going over a part of the seabed where the methane was dissolving out into the seawater in such volumes that the bubbles were actually reaching the surface rather than being absorbed by the seawater. So yes, it can happen, but it's not a direct linkage. It's got, I suspect the danger is more that the areas of the Arctic a little bit further away, a little bit further south than the shores of the Arctic Ocean, somewhere around, the middle of Yukon or the middle of the Northwest Territories or whatever, Mackenzie Valley, that sort of thing, where you do get quite hot summers. You'll find that the permafrost is melting there rather than the shores of the Arctic Ocean. That's a likelier case for large-scale warming. At the moment, there is some warm melting going on and some emissions of methane, but probably only apart from these individual seabed emissions, which, by the way, were mostly off the mouths of very big Siberian rivers, which are delivering fresh water into the ocean and perhaps melting the permafrost underneath there. It's the southernmost 5% of the permafrost zone is probably starting gradually to melt. Is that a big enough feedback to trigger the rest? I'm not sure. We don't know how these cascades will work. There's a huge amount of frantic work being done about this at the moment, but we don't know the answers.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And as I mentioned, Dr. Homer Dixon is working with a network, I know, of scientists sort of worldwide to look at this issue, but it's a very complicated one, as you indicate. We have a question from Lou, and again, something you touched on, but could you talk a little more about the technologies to remove CO2 from the ocean? How promising are those technologies?
Well, removing CO2 from the oceans, and when you mean actually removing it, some of it will come out if you remove CO2 from the air, the whole partial pressure business. So for every ton you get out, half a ton comes about and takes its place in the air because it was in the ocean before, but now it's not being held down. therefore the whole clearing up process takes longer and costs more. But actively removing carbon dioxide from the oceans, the only plausible proposals for carbon dioxide removal, CDR, to do that, involve grinding up large amounts of rock, specific kinds, olivine, things like that, mountains of it, and dumping it in the ocean where it will absorb very large amounts of carbon dioxide, or dumping iron filings and things like that in the ocean to provide the needed trace elements to enable a huge bloom of algae. And this is a natural phenomenon. I mean, you do get these algal blooms when particularly you used to get them in the North Pacific a lot because all the dust would blow over from the sort of drier parts of Central Asia. That's happening less. But, so stimulating algal blooms or dumping ground up mountains into the oceans are ways that you could absorb some of the carbon dioxide that's in the oceans. Hugely costly and potentially worrisome because we are really mucking with the environment of the more than half of the life on the planet that lives in the oceans. So I would like to see a good deal more research done as fast as you can, chaps, but but a good deal more research done before we start doing that on a large scale. But yes, the carbon dioxide in the oceans is a huge, invisible problem looming overhead because the oceans themselves are, of course, warming. And as they warm, they can contain less dissolved gas. So quite apart from the whole partial pressure business, warmer water can contain less dissolved gas. As the oceans warm, they both expand, sea level rise, and they have to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere because they can't contain it anymore. The knee bone is connected to the thigh bone and several other joints as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a good caution because the solution to one problem might be at hand, but it in turn can cause another, and the unintended consequences of some of these solutions.
Principal cause of problems in the world is the solutions to the last set of problems.
Yes. There's a question from David. He's asking a very specific question about a particular project. What about the Mir reflector project and your assessment of that? So
this is mirrors in space.
Yes. Mir, M-E-E-R, Mir.
Ah, okay. I'm not sure I know about it. Give me a little more information.
I don't have any more on that. So we'll move on. Move on to another question. I'm getting one right now.
Talk about yourselves.
Yeah, here we go. This is really a question about how about large corporations and big banks and think tanks? Where should they be looking for solutions?
Well, banks ought to be using their lending power to restrict certain activities and encourage others. And some of them are doing that, but they're not doing enough of it. Because you got to get the money for, large investments go through banks. And if the banks decide that, what you're doing is going to produce a stranded asset because we can't afford to go on producing this carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of what you're proposing to do, then the bank won't lend you money and the project won't go ahead. So they have a lot of power, and they're beginning to use it. Insurance companies, by the way, have the same kind of key position in terms of leverage and an even stronger interest in not encouraging investments that will, in the end, get very badly damaged and hit them hard. So them, yes, think tanks come in a variety of flavors. Many of them are actually lobbying organizations pretending to be think tanks. And they will do whatever it is they're paid to do. I mean, but the genuinely independent ones are very useful because they come up with, or at least publicize, things the public needs to know about in terms of where do we go with this stuff. Corporations are the trickiest ones. I mean, there's a great many companies that will not suffer any from cleaning up their act in terms of emissions. And in fact, in the end, will have a competitive advantage if they can demonstrate that they are cleaner than the rival companies in terms of emissions. But for those who are in the so-called sunset industries, the ones that actually do depend heavily on fossil fuels, they have essentially two options. One of them is to go down fighting, and there's some of them, quite a lot of them, who have actually, they're starting to move out of overt denial. I mean, they spent 20 years getting, shills in lab coats to pretend that there was no global warming or whatever. And that, I think that tactic and the sort of diversion and distraction and denial is more or less running out its string. But you find that, even another 20 years of producing oil will make my pile. And, maybe we're going down eventually, but I will have made my money and retired to wherever it is. I'm planning to retire before that. So let's keep going for now. How do we keep going for now? And the strategies are changing. One of the things that is quite striking, actually, now, is that they're jumping on board. When I was talking about geoengineering, of course, I was talking about geoengineering in order to keep the planet cool enough that we can go on with the key work of getting the carbon dioxide emissions down and then clearing the rest out of the atmosphere. But you see them beginning to jump on it because they think, well, maybe we could persuade people that geoengineering will solve the problem and we don't have to get all the emissions down. It's a lie. No scientist believes it. The people working on geoengineering don't believe or intend that. But if you can fool enough of the public, you've got a little bit more space to make money in. The other strategy that is emerging actually quite visibly in the last year or so is to encourage people to change their lifestyle just enough to feel good about themselves. So they won't demand large political things that will hurt the cause of the fossil fuel producers or users. So, I mean, for example, the concept of carbon footprint, which you would assume was devised by, some campaigning group that wanted to get your attention because you would then do your duty and use. Carbon footprint was invented by British Petroleum. Because if you can persuade enough people that they're doing their job by calculating their carbon footprint and, using less water when they brush their teeth or whatever, then they won't be campaigning against fossil fuels. They will think, well, I've done my bit. So there's a lot of that sort of thing going on where the ones who want to stay in the business are finding new and rather less direct ways of challenging the perception that the job has to be done fully. We got to get the emissions down and over. There you go.
Well, thank you so much, Gwyn. We are pretty much at the end of our time, but I do have one final question for you, and if you can share it with us. Somebody is asking, do you have a title for the new book?
The new book is called Planetary Maintenance Engineers.
Fantastic. I was hoping you would say that. So.
And there will, I hope, be a mini-series to go with it. We're filming
Yeah.
all the interviews. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. When I saw that title, it sort of raises questions. What does this mean? So I think it's a great title, and the fact that you gave us the context for it was quite wonderful. So I wanted to thank you so much, Gwyn, for joining us tonight from London. I know it's very late there, but it's a great pleasure to hear you speak again. And I'm so glad you could join us for this series. We've had a long relationship with you here at Royal Roads. I know you've spoken here before, and we were honored to be able to offer you an honorary doctorate back in 2002. But I want to thank everybody who joined us today. The audience out there. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Times Colonist newspaper here in Victoria, and of course to thank the wonderful Royal Road staff who helped to coordinate this event.
Times Colonist sponsored it?
Yes.
Well, tell them they should start running my column again.
I will definitely.
I had no idea. I thought I was anathema there.
I will definitely tell them that. It's a partial sponsorship. Okay. So if any of you out there would like to revisit any of the talks from the series, you can find the recordings at rruchangemakers.ca. And with that, and again, a thank you to you, Gwyn. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good night, Philip. Thank you.
Good night.